On the banks of the Tigris, where the summer heat turned the earth into cracked crust and spring floods brought life to the fields, a state emerged that would become the most powerful military machine of the ancient world, Assyria. The name evokes images of armies, siege towers, and conquered nation. Yet, the path of this empire began not with triumphs, but with a struggle for survival in a world where every neighbor could become an enemy. The city of Ashur appeared on the map of Mesopotamia approximately in the 21st century BC. A modest settlement of merchants and farmers found itself squeezed between the powers of antiquity. From the south, Babylon pressed with its culture and literacy. From the north, mountain tribes threatened. From the west, caravans of Syrian merchants arrived. The Assyrians survived by trading tin, textiles, copper, and grain. Their merchant caravans reached Anatolia, where a trading colony called Karum was established in the city of Kanish. Clay tablets from Kanish tell of business correspondence, prices for goods, and the family affairs of merchants who had not seen their relatives for months. Trade required protection. Caravans became the prey of bandits, and the city itself needed strong walls. Gradually, the Assyrians realized a simple truth. In a world of power, the strongest survive. The first kings of Assyria were more like elders. They consulted with a council of nobles and reported to the temple of the god Ashur, whose priests possessed immense influence. By the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, Assyria was transforming from a trading city into a military power. The first king about whom reliable information has been preserved was Shamshi-Adad I, who reigned approximately from 1815 to 1782 BC. A descendant of an Amorite nomadic tribe, he seized power by force and created the first Assyrian state, subjugating territories from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. Shamshi-Adad understood that force alone was not enough. He built roads, fortified cities, and created a system of governing conquered lands. After his death, his empire disintegrated. Babylon, under King Hammurabi, subjugated most of Mesopotamia, and Assyria again found itself on the periphery. For several centuries, Assyrian kings paid tribute to stronger neighbors and participated in trade alliances. It was a time of humiliation, but also of gathering strength. The Assyrians learned from their enemies, adopted military technologies, and perfected their weapons. By the 10th century BC, Assyria had fallen under the rule of Mitanni, a state of the Hurrians. The Mitannian kings kept the Assyrian rulers on a short leash, demanding tribute and interfering in royal succession. The Assyrian kings outwardly submitted, but within the country, preparations for a revanche were underway. The army was perfected, cities were strengthened, and resources were accumulated. Liberation came in the 14th century BC. Mitanni found itself caught between the Egypt of Pharaoh Thutmose and the Hittite Empire. King Ashur-Uballit I, who reigned approximately from 1365 to 1330 BC, ascended the Assyrian throne. He broke vassal relations, declared himself independent, and began campaigns of conquest. Mitanni, occupied by war with the Hittites, could not respond. This was a turning point. A small state, having spent centuries in the shadows, declared its ambitions. Ashur-Uballit created the foundation of the future empire. His successors continued his work, fighting Babylon, subduing the remnants of Mitanni, and repelling raids from mountain tribes. The Assyrian army was transforming into a professional military machine. By the end of the 10th century, Assyria controlled a significant part of northern Mesopotamia. Conquered cities were subjected to tribute, and inhabitants were taken captive for construction labor. The system of deportation, which became the hallmark of the empire, was born then. Resettling conquered peoples served several purposes: to weaken occupied territories, to provide labor for construction, and to mix peoples to prevent uprisings. The path to dominance was not simple. In the 10th century, Assyria faced a new challenge. From the west, a wave of migration was approaching that would sweep away many civilizations. The Hittite Empire would collapse under the blows of the Sea Peoples. Mycenaean Greece would descend into a dark age. Aramean tribes, nomads from the Syrian desert, began to infiltrate the lands of Mesopotamia, attacking caravans and ravaging settlements. The old world was falling apart. The new one had yet to be born. The Arameans came not as an organized army, but as countless tribes, each with its own chiefs. They were shepherds and warriors accustomed to the harsh life of the desert. To the settled inhabitants of Mesopotamia, the Arameans seemed like a wild horde. They spoke a Semitic language close to Assyrian, but their way of life was alien to urban dwellers. The Assyrian kings of the 11th century waged a continuous struggle against Aramean raids. Tukulti-Ninurta I, who reigned approximately from 1244 to 1208 BC, was one of the most warlike rulers of this era. He captured Babylon, the ancient city of scholarship, and carried away the statue of the god Marduk to Ashur, an act of sacrilege that shocked the Mesopotamian world. Tukulti-Ninurta's successes cost Assyria dearly. The conquests exhausted resources, and the wars fatigued the people. The capture of Babylon and the desecration of its shrines turned the nobility against the king. Babylon was a symbol of Mesopotamian civilization. Respect for it was deeply rooted in the consciousness of all inhabitants of the region, including the Assyrian. Tukulti-Ninurta's actions seemed like barbarism. The king was overthrown and killed by his own son in a conspiracy. After his death, Assyria entered a period of decline. The following decades were marked by weak rulers, palace intrigues, and the continuing onslaught of the Aramean. Assyrian cities were one by one cut off from the center. Caravan routes became unsafe. Rural settlements were emptied, and inhabitants fled behind city walls or perished. It seemed Assyria would repeat the fate of other states destroyed by the migration of peoples. Yet, Assyrian statehood proved resilient. The cities, first and foremost Ashur itself, withstood the assault. Their powerful walls, built of burnt brick several dozen cubits high and equipped with towers, did not succumb to the siege. The Arameans were brave warriors, but the art of siege was unknown to them. Gradually, the wave of the invasion subsided. The Aramean tribes settled on the conquered lands and mixed with the local population. By the end of the 10th century, the situation stabilized. Tiglath-Pileser I, who reigned approximately from 1115 to 1077 BC, ascended the throne. This king became the savior of Assyria, and his reign was marked by a series of successful military campaigns that drove back the Arameans and restored the Assyrian presence in the region. Tiglath-Pileser was not just a warrior, he was an organizer. His annals, carved on clay prisms and stone stelae, describe every campaign in detail. The inscriptions provide a vivid picture of the military affairs of that time. The army marched in the spring, when the roads dried. Warriors carried spears with bronze heads, swords, and bows. Armor was made of bronze scales on a leather base or thick felt. Chariots, pulled by horses, served as platforms for archers. A siege required months of preparation. The army surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines. Then, the construction of siege mounds began. Earthen ramps, along which a battering ram could be moved to the walls. The rams were massive logs with bronze heads, suspended on chains inside a wooden tower on wheels. Simultaneously, archers showered the walls with arrows, preventing defenders from interfering with the ram. Tiglath-Pileser conducted 28 military campaigns in his 8-year reign. He fought on all fronts. In the north against the Neri tribes in the mountains of Armenia, in the east against the Kassites, in the west against the Arameans, and in the south against Babylon. His army reached the Mediterranean Sea, where the king performed a ritual cleansing of his weapons, an ancient custom symbolizing power over the land from sea to sea. The king hunted wild bulls and lions, which was considered a demonstration of royal courage. According to his words, he killed 120 lions while on foot and 800 from his chariot, as well as many bulls. These figures, recorded in royal inscriptions, may have contained exaggerations typical of that time. Despite his military successes, Tiglath-Pileser did not create a stable empire. The conquered territories were too vast, and communications were unreliable. After his death, Assyria again shrank to its core land. The 10th and 9th centuries were a time of new decline. The Arameans became active again, cutting Assyria off from the sea and trade routes. It was a dark time. Kings ruled for short periods, often falling victim to conspiracies. The economy suffered from the lack of trade. The population declined. In the annals, there are few records of great deeds, only sparse mentions of small campaigns. But it was during these decades that important changes occurred in Assyria. Military organization improved, and iron began to replace bronze in weapon production. The tactics of using cavalry were developed. The administration became more bureaucratized. By the beginning of the 9th century, Assyria resembled a sleeping predator. Outwardly weakened, it still possessed the potential for rebirth. The cities preserved the memory of past greatness. The military tradition was not broken. Only a strong ruler was needed. Such was Adad-Nirari II, who ascended the throne in approximately 912 BC. His reign marked the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian kingdom, when the power would turn into an empire without equal in the Middle East. Adad-Nirari was a methodical conqueror. He did not strive for quick victories. His strategy consisted of the gradual expansion of borders, the strengthening of conquered territories, and the creation of a control system. His first campaigns were directed against Aramean principalities in the Kabur Valley. Adad-Nirari acted consistently. He smashed the army of one principality, besieged its capital, and then moved to the next target. Each victory was consolidated by the construction of a fortress and the placement of a garrison. The conquered population was partially deported, and Assyrian colonists were moved in their place. His son, Tukulti-Ninurta II, continued his father's work. His reign was short, from 891 to 884 BC, but productive. He expanded the borders to the east into the Zagros Mountain. Mountain warfare required different tactics. Heavy chariots were useless on narrow paths. The main role was played by infantry and light cavalry. Prosperity began with the reign of Ashur-Nisirpal II, who ascended the throne in 883 BC. This king ruled for 25 years and turned Assyria into a power that struck terror into the region. Ashur-Nisirpal was a ruthless conqueror. His annals are filled with descriptions of the executions of defeated enemies. Captives were impaled, limbs were cut off, and eyes were gouged out. These executions served as an instrument of terror, a means of intimidating potential opponents. Yet, Ashur-Nisirpal was also a great builder. In 879 BC, he moved the capital to the city of Kalhu, also known as Nimrud. The king built a palace there, decorated with reliefs and statues. The walls were covered with stone slabs depicting military campaigns, lion hunts, and ritual scenes. These reliefs allow us to see the world of ancient Assyria through the eyes of its creator. The palace in Kalhu amazed contemporaries. The ceremonial halls were several meters high. Ceilings were supported by columns made of precious woods. Floors were laid with burnt tile in geometric pattern. Walls were adorned with reliefs and frescoes depicting winged bulls with human heads, guardian spirits, and scenes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The opening of the new palace was marked by a feast. According to an inscription on a stone stele, Ashur-Nisirpal invited 69,754 people, a figure indicated in the royal inscription. The feast lasted 10 days. Guests were treated to bulls and sheep, poultry and fish, bread and sweets, wine and beer. It was a demonstration of power, a way to show that the Assyrian king possessed countless riches. The military campaigns of Ashur-Nisirpal covered all directions. He fought against Urartu, a new state in the mountains of the Armenian highlands. The Urartians were related to the Hurrians and inherited their military prowess. They built powerful fortresses on inaccessible cliffs, bred horses, and were skilled metallurgists. The war with Urartu would become a constant theme of Assyrian history for the next 2 centuries. In the west, Ashur-Nisirpal reached the Mediterranean Sea, subduing Aramean and Phoenician cities. The Phoenicians were navigators and merchants. Their ships plied the Mediterranean. The cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos paid tribute in cedar wood, purple textiles, glassware, and ivory. In the east, his armies penetrated the Zagros Mountains, fighting against Median and Iranian tribes. These lands were rich in iron, which was becoming increasingly important. Control over sources of iron gave an advantage over rivals. The reign of Ashur-Nasirpal laid the foundations of the empire, but the empire itself was not yet established. The conquered lands were loosely connected to the center. Uprisings erupted regularly. It was necessary to create a system of government that would turn disparate conquests into a unified state. This task would be solved by his son, Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III ascended the throne in 859 BC and ruled for 35 years. He conducted 32 military campaigns. His armies fought from Urartu in the north to the Arabian Desert in the south. Shalmaneser did not just conquer. He created a system of provinces, appointed governors, built fortresses, and laid roads. A significant event was the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. The Assyrian army clashed with a coalition of western states, including Damascus, Aramean principalities, Phoenician cities, and the Kingdom of Israel. Shalmaneser claimed victory, but in fact, he failed to break the coalition. The western states maintained their independence. The final years of Shalmaneser's reign were marred by an internal crisis. In 827 BC, when the king grew old, a rebellion broke out. It was led by the crown prince Ashur-Dan I, who had not been appointed heir. The rebellious prince seized several large cities. He was joined by disgruntled nobles and priests. This was a true civil war that split Assyria. Shalmaneser appointed another son, Shamshi-Adad I, as heir, who led the army against the rebels. The war lasted several years and devastated many regions. Only in 823 BC did Shamshi-Adad win and ascend the throne. The cost was enormous. The empire weakened, provinces broke away, and the treasury was empty. Shamshi-Adad I ruled from 823 to 811 BC. He spent most of his reign restoring order. His wife, Shemaramat, played an active role in politics. After her husband's death, she became regent for her young son, Adad-Nirari III. This was a rare situation in the ancient world. Shemaramat reigned for about 5 years and, judging by the inscriptions, was held in high regard. Later, Greek historians would create many legends around her image, turning the real queen into the mythical Semiramis. Adad-Nirari III, having reached the age of majority, ruled from 810 to 783 BC. He attempted to revive the policy of conquest, conducting several campaigns in Syria and Palestine. His armies reached Damascus and laid the city under tribute. However, internal problems did not disappear, and the Assyrian nobility strengthened to the point that they began to compete with royal power. Major provincial governors acted as independent rulers. After the death of Adad-Nirari, Assyria entered a period of weakening central authority. The following kings ruled under conditions of the growing power of provincial governors. These magnates controlled significant resources and could ignore orders from the capital. Assyria turned into a loose federation where the king was more of a first among equals. The weakening of Assyria did not go unnoticed. In the north, Urartu, led by King Sarduri II, went on the offensive. In the west, Syria and Damascus regained their independence. In the east, Median tribes were uniting. In the south, Babylon remained a potential rival. Salvation came in 745 BC, when Tiglath-Pileser III, one of the greatest Assyrian kings, ascended the throne. He likely came to power as a result of a coup. The new king was not a direct heir to the throne. Sources on these events are contradictory, but it is clear that Tiglath-Pileser was a usurper, or from a junior branch of the royal family. The first thing Tiglath-Pileser did was carry out a radical reform of the army, Previously, the force consisted of a small royal contingent and provincial militias, collected only for the duration of campaign. Provincial troops were subordinate to local governors, which made them unreliable. Tiglath-Pileser created a large standing army, subordinate only to the king. It was a professional force, including infantry, cavalry, chariots, and engineering units. Warriors received pay from the royal treasury, were supplied centrally, and underwent regular training. The second reform concerned administration. Tiglath-Pileser divided large provinces into smaller ones so that no single governor could control too many resources. He appointed royal commissioners who oversaw the governors and reported to the king. A system of couriers and postal stations was created, allowing orders to be transmitted quickly over long distances. The third reform touched upon deportations. Tiglath-Pileser systematized this practice. After every conquest, a significant portion of the population of the conquered area was resettled to other parts of the empire, and settlers moved onto the freed land. This policy pursued the goals of destroying local identity, preventing uprisings, providing labor for state projects, and creating a mixed population loyal to the empire. Over the course of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser and his successors, hundreds of thousands of people were deported. Having strengthened his power, Tiglath-Pileser began a new wave of conquests. His first target was Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser invaded Babylonia, defeated the Chaldean king, and in 729 BC was crowned as the king of Babylon under the name Pulu. This was a brilliant political move. Instead of a simple occupation, Tiglath-Pileser accepted the crown of Babylon and became the legitimate ruler in the eyes of the Babylonians. The unification of Assyria and Babylonia created a state that controlled all of Mesopotamia. In the west, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Syria and Palestine. His armies besieged Damascus for 2 years until it fell in 732 BC. The inhabitants were deported, and the city was destroyed. The small states of Palestine, Israel, Judah, and Philistine cities were forced to pay tribute. When the king of Israel rebelled, Tiglath-Pileser invaded the country, captured part of the territory, and took thousands of inhabitants into captivity. This event, mentioned in the Bible, was the first act of a tragedy that ended with the disappearance of the kingdom of Israel. In the north, a stubborn struggle was waged against Urartu. Tiglath-Pileser made several campaigns into the Armenian highlands, ravaging Urartian fortresses. Although he could not completely crush Urartu, he managed to limit its expansion and regain border areas. When Tiglath-Pileser died in 727 BC, he left his successor an empire stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. This was the greatest state of its time, possessing a powerful army, effective administration, and enormous resources. But the empire required constant wars to maintain its existence. Conquered peoples required control, borders required defense, the army required booty. Shalmaneser V, the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, ruled for only 5 years, from 727 to 722 BC. The main event was the siege of Samaria, the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Israel attempted to rebel, hoping for help from Egypt. Shalmaneser besieged the city in 724 BC. The siege lasted 3 years. Samaria was well fortified. Only in 722 BC did the city fall. Its inhabitants were deported to Media and other regions. In their place were resettled people from other provinces. This event was of great significance. 10 of the Israelite tribes were scattered across the empire and eventually assimilated. They went down in history as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, maintained independence but became an Assyrian vassal, paying tribute. Shalmaneser V died under mysterious circumstances, possibly as a result of a coup. Sargon II, one of the greatest Assyrian kings, ascended the throne. His origin remains a mystery. Sources do not name his father, which was extremely unusual. Perhaps Sargon was a usurper who seized power and took the name of the great ancient king Sargon of Akkad, founder of the first Mesopotamian Empire. Sargon II ruled from 722 to 705 BC. His reign was filled with continuous war. In the west, he suppressed a rebellion in Syria and Palestine, defeating a coalition that included Egypt and Philistine cities. In the east, he fought against the Elamites and Median tribes. In the north, the main opponent remained Urartu, which, under King Rusa I, attempted to regain its position. In 714 BC, Sargon performed a grandiose campaign against Urartu. His army passed through the mountains and appeared unexpectedly in the heart of the Urartian kingdom. The Urartian capital, Tushpa, barely escaped capture. Sargon ravaged the surroundings, seized immense booty, and returned a triumphant hero. This campaign weakened Urartu so much that it never recovered. One of the most important problems was the increasing pressure of nomadic tribes from the north. The Sumerians, driven from the Black Sea steppes by the Scythians, began to infiltrate Asia Minor. The Phrygian kingdom collapsed under their onslaught around 700 BC. The Sumerians also threatened the Assyrian borders. Sargon tried to stop them, but the nomads were elusive. Inside the empire, Sargon continued the policy of assimilation. Deportations reached a massive scale. Babylonia, where an uprising broke out led by the Chaldean leader Marduk-apla-iddina, known in the Bible as Merodach-Baladan, was brutally pacified. Sargon twice expelled him from Babylon and established direct Assyrian rule there. A great achievement of Sargon was the construction of a new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, which means Fortress of Sargon. The city was founded in 717 BC north of Nineveh. Sargon wanted to create an ideal capital, free from the influence of the old nobility. The city occupied an area of about 300 hectares and was surrounded by powerful walls with 7 gates. In the center rose the royal palace, a structure of 210 rooms, decorated with reliefs and statues. The construction of Dur-Sharrukin required colossal resources. Tens of thousands of workers, most of whom were deportees, labored for years. Cedar beams were brought from Lebanon, stone from quarries, and gold and silver from the treasuries of conquered cities. The city was completed in 707 BC, and the king ceremoniously moved there. In 705 BC, Sargon died in battle against the Sumerians in the mountains of Anatolia. His body was not found and buried with royal honors, which was considered a terrible omen. The new king, Sennacherib, Sargon's son, perceived his father's death as a bad sign. He left Dur-Sharrukin and moved the court to Nineveh. Sargon's city was abandoned and gradually turned into ruin. Sennacherib ruled from 705 to 681 BC. He was a talented military leader and a cruel ruler. His main problem was Babylon, which constantly rebelled. The Babylonians considered themselves the heirs of ancient culture and did not wish to submit to Assyria. The rebellion was supported by Elam. Sennacherib suppressed the mutinies several times, but they erupted again. In 689 BC, driven to frenzy, Sennacherib made a decision. He besieged Babylon, took it by storm, and ordered the city to be razed to the ground. The walls were leveled, the temples were burned, and the palaces were looted. The statue of the god Marduk was taken to Assyria. Sennacherib ordered the destruction of even the canal system, turning fertile land into a swamp. This was an unprecedented act of sacrilege that shocked the ancient world. The destruction of Babylon had serious consequences. Many Assyrians, including priests and nobles, considered Sennacherib's actions to be blasphemy. When Sennacherib was killed in 681 BC in the temple of the god Ninurta in Nineveh, many perceived it as divine retribution. The killers were the king's own sons, unhappy that he had appointed his younger brother, Esarhaddon, as heir. A short civil war began, which was won by Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon ruled from 680 to 669 BC. He was a clever politician who understood that the destruction of Babylon had harmed the legitimacy of Assyrian rule. One of his first decisions was to restore the ancient city. Esarhaddon ordered the rebuilding of temples, the restoration of walls, and the return of the statue of Marduk. He regularly visited Babylon, participated in religious ceremonies, and demonstrated respect for tradition. This policy of reconciliation was successful. Babylonia calmed down, and uprisings ceased. On the western borders, the situation remained tense. Egypt, united under the Nubian dynasty, supported anti-Assyrian sentiments in Syria and Palestine. Esarhaddon decided to strike at Egypt itself. In 674 BC, the Assyrian army invaded the Nile Delta. The campaign was difficult, but Esarhaddon won, captured Memphis, and proclaimed himself pharaoh. This was a triumph. Assyria became the first power to unite Mesopotamia and Egypt under its rule. However, holding Egypt proved more difficult. The Egyptians did not wish to submit to foreigners, and the Nubian dynasty retreated to the south and continued the fight. Local princes raised a rebellion at the first opportunity, and Esarhaddon was forced to station a significant garrison and constantly send reinforcements. In 669 BC, while preparing for another campaign into Egypt to suppress an uprising, Esarhaddon died on the road. He was succeeded by two sons. Ashurbanipal became king of Assyria, and Shamash-Shum Ukin became king of Babylon. This was an attempt to solve the problem of relations between the two main centers of the empire by giving Babylon its own king, who, however, had to obey his older brother. Ashurbanipal ruled from 668 to approximately 627 BC, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire. He was not only a warrior but also a scholar, a collector of knowledge, and a patron of the art. His reign marked the cultural heyday of Assyria, but also became the beginning of the end of the empire. Ashurbanipal received an excellent education. He knew how to read and write, which was rare for kings. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and literature. His greatest achievement was the creation of a library in Nineveh, the largest collection of cuneiform texts in the ancient world. The Library of Ashurbanipal contained more than 20,000 clay tablets collected from all over Mesopotamia. Here were literary works, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, religious texts, scientific treatises on astronomy and medicine, historical chronicles, and royal inscriptions. The king sent agents to cities with orders to copy or confiscate valuable texts. The work was organized professionally, tablets were cataloged, and seals were placed on them. But Ashurbanipal was not only a book lover, he continued the policy of conquest. His first task was the final subjugation of Egypt. In 667 BC, shortly after ascending the throne, he sent an army to the Nile Delta. The Assyrian troops routed the Egyptian-Nubian coalition and captured even Thebes, the capital of Upper Egypt. Thebes was looted so thoroughly that its decline became a proverb. However, the triumph was short-lived. Egypt was too far from the center of the empire. A local prince, Psamtik, took advantage of the Assyrians' preoccupation and declared independence. By 651 BC, he had united all of Egypt, founding the Saidi dynasty. Ashurbanipal was too busy with problems closer to home, and Egypt left Assyrian control forever. The main tragedy was the war with his brother. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, king of Babylon, formally obeyed Ashurbanipal but in fact ruled independently. Gradually, tension grew between the brothers. Shamash-Shum-Ukin felt like a junior partner in an unequal alliance. In 652 BC, Shamash-Shum-Ukin rebelled. The war lasted 4 years and was cruel. Babylon withstood a long siege. The city was surrounded, food deliveries were stopped, the defenders held out with desperate courage. Hunger reached such a degree that, according to sources, people ate leather and grass. In 648 BC, Babylon fell. Shamash-Shum-Ukin perished by some accounts. He burned alive in his palace. By others, he was executed. Ashurbanipal suppressed the rebellion with ruthless cruelty. This fratricidal war undermined the strength of the empire. While Assyria exhausted itself in an internal conflict, external enemies grew stronger. Elam, the main ally of Shamshi-Adad I, was completely crushed. Its capital, Susa, fell in 645 BC. The country was ravaged so thoroughly that it never recovered as an independent state. But this was a Pyrrhic victory. Assyria's resources were running out. The army was fatigued, the population suffered. On the eastern borders, Media was gaining strength. The Median tribes, for centuries fragmented, began to unite under the rule of King Cyaxares. Around 625 BC, Cyaxares created a strong, centralized state with a professional army, organized along a Syrian line. Media began to threaten the eastern provinces. But Ashurbanipal, occupied with other problems, could not effectively resist this new threat. The final years of Ashurbanipal's reign are hidden in fog. Sources become sparse, royal inscriptions cease, and chronicles fall silent. It is known that the king died approximately in 627 BC, but the circumstances of his death are unclear. He was succeeded by his son, Ashur-Etil-Ilani, about whom almost nothing is known. His reign lasted only a few years and was marked by internal turmoil. A struggle for power began in the country between various claimants to the throne. Provincial governors declared independence. The army was falling apart. By 621 BC, the last significant king of Assyria, Sin-Shar-Ishkun, sat on the throne. He tried to stabilize the situation, but it was already too late. The empire, held together by fear and military force, began to fall apart as soon as these supports weakened. Conquered peoples, who had suffered for centuries under the Assyrian yoke, rose one after another. Babylon, barely recovered from the devastation of the civil war, regained its independence under the rule of the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar, who founded the last great Babylonian dynasty. Nabopolassar seized power in Babylon in 626 BC. He was an energetic and ambitious ruler who dreamed not just of liberating Babylonia, but of taking revenge on Assyria for centuries of humiliation. The first years passed in a struggle against Assyrian troops. Battles were fought with varying success, but Nabopolassar was patient, gradually expanding the territory under his control. A decisive moment was the alliance of Babylon with Media. Cyaxares, king of Media, was also interested in the destruction of Assyria, which for decades had interfered in the affairs of the Iranian tribes. In 614 BC, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares concluded an alliance, sealed by a dynastic marriage. Nabopolassar's son, the future king Nebuchadnezzar, married Cyaxares' daughter. This alliance sealed the fate of Assyria. In 614 BC, the united Babylonian-Median army began an offensive into the heart of Assyria. The first target was the city of Ashur, the ancient capital and religious center of the empire. The city, founded more than 2,000 years ago and having withstood countless sieges, now faced enemies burning with a thirst for revenge. The siege was short. Ashur fell and was destroyed to the foundation. The temples were burned, the statues of the gods were smashed, and the population was slaughtered. The city whose name the whole empire bore ceased to exist. The next target of the allies was Nineveh, the greatest city of its time, the capital of the empire, a symbol of Assyrian power. Nineveh occupied a huge area, about 750 hectares, and was surrounded by walls about 12 kilometers long and up to 25 meters high. 15 gates led into the city. Inside were the palaces of kings, the temples of gods, the Library of Ashurbanipal, the houses of nobles, and the quarters of craftsmen. The population reached 100,000. The siege of Nineveh began in the summer of 612 BC. Babylonian and Median troops surrounded the city from all sides, blocking supply routes. Sin-Shar-Ishkun, the last king of Assyria, led the defense. He had a large army, significant food supplies, and powerful fortification. The defenders fought desperately, understanding that defeat meant the end not only for them but for the entire empire. The siege lasted several months. The allies built siege mounds, moved battering rams to the walls, and showered the city with projectiles from siege engines. But Nineveh held. Then the attackers used a different tactic. The flooding of the Tigris, on whose bank the city stood, was used against the defenders. The Babylonians and Medes destroyed the dams upstream, directing the power of the spring flood against the city walls. The water washed away the foundation of the fortifications, and a section of the wall collapsed. The final assault took place at the end of the summer of 612 BC. The exact date is unknown, but tradition names the month of Abu July or August. Babylonian and Median warriors poured through the breach. A massacre began that lasted for several days. Sin-Shar-Ishkun perished while defending his palace. By some accounts, he fell in battle. By others, he burned himself alive along with his family and treasures. The city was looted with unprecedented thoroughness. Everything valuable was removed: gold and silver, statues, weapons, textiles, and works of art. After the looting began systematic destruction. The palaces were burned. The temples were taken apart stone by stone, and the walls were razed. The Babylonians and Medes wanted not just to defeat Assyria, but to wipe it off the face of the earth, to destroy even the memory of the hated empire. Fires raged for weeks. So many wooden structures were in the city that the heat was so strong that the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library were scorched, becoming as hard as stone. Paradoxically, it was the fire that ensured their preservation for millennia. The few inhabitants who survived the massacre were led into slavery. The city emptied. Nineveh, the greatest capital of the ancient world, ceased to exist. The prophecies of Old Testament prophets, especially Nahum, who predicted the fall of the city, were fulfilled with terrifying accuracy. Woe to the city of blood! Nineveh is ruined. Who will lament for her? Wrote Nahum. His words reflected the feelings of millions of people who had suffered under the Assyrian yoke. The fall of Nineveh did not mean the immediate end of Assyria. The remnants of the army retreated to the west, to the city of Haran, in Upper Mesopotamia. There, Ashur-Uballit II proclaimed himself king and attempted to continue the resistance. He turned for help to Egypt, which feared the excessive strengthening of Babylon. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II sent an army to help the last Assyrian king. This was a strange turn of history. Egypt, which for centuries had fought against Assyria, now tried to save it. In 609 BC, the Babylonians and Medes besieged Haran. The city fell after a short siege, and Ashur-Uballit disappeared. He likely died or fled. The attempt by the Egyptians and the remnants of the Assyrians to retake Haran in 608 BC failed. After this, Assyria as a state ceased to exist. 3,000 years of history, from the first settlements on the banks of the Tigris to the greatest empire of antiquity, ended in ruins and ashes. The people who had struck terror into the entire known world dissolved among other peoples of Mesopotamia, leaving behind only destroyed cities and the memory of cruelty. The Assyrian Empire disappeared, but the trace it left proved indelible. Methods of government, military technologies, and administrative practices developed by the Assyrians were adopted by their victors. The Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, the Median Kingdom of Cyaxares, and later the Persian power of Cyrus and Darius, all of them were built on the foundation laid by Assyria. The concept of a unified empire uniting different peoples under the rule of one king, the system of provinces and governors, the standing army, the road network, and the postal service, all these were Assyrian inventions, perfected by the Persian. The military art of Assyria was unsurpassed. The Assyrians were the first to create a truly professional army where warriors received pay, underwent regular training, and were organized into specialized units. Infantry was divided into heavy, with armor and large shields, and light, armed with bow. Cavalry evolved from an auxiliary arm to a striking force. Chariots remained a prestigious arm of service where members of the nobility served. The art of siege reached unprecedented heights under the Assyrians. They created an arsenal of specialized siege machines, battering rams of various designs, siege towers, mobile shields, and catapults. Assyrian engineers knew how to build siege mounds, dig tunnels under walls, and divert water supply. The systematic approach to siege was an Assyrian contribution to military affairs. The cruelty of the Assyrians became a byword, but one must understand the context of the era. The ancient world was cruel, war was waged for annihilation, and the Assyrians did not invent cruelty. They systematized it and turned it into an instrument of state policy. The goal was simple: to intimidate enemies so much that they would not even think of resistance. However, it was this policy of terror that turned against them when the empire weakened. Paradoxically, the same Assyria was a center of culture. The Library of Ashurbanipal contained treasures of Mesopotamian literature collected from all over the region. Assyrian scribes copied ancient texts, created catalogs, and commented on obscure passages. Without their work, many works of Sumerian and Akkadian literature would have been lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the myth of Atrahasis, the Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish. All these texts are known to us thanks to copies made for the Library of Ashurbanipal. Assyrian art was distinguished by realism and attention to detail. The reliefs on the palace walls depicted not abstract religious scenes but specific historical events, military campaigns, sieges of cities, and lion hunts. Artists conveyed anatomy with striking accuracy and depicted weapons and clothing so detailed that modern researchers can study the material culture of the era. The scenes of lion hunts from the palace of Ashurbanipal are considered masterpieces of ancient art. The architecture of Assyria was monumental. Palaces were built on artificial platforms, rising above the surrounding terrain. Entrances were guarded by giant statues of winged bulls with human heads, lamassu, weighing dozens of tons. These creatures symbolized strength and wisdom. The cities of Assyria were well planned. Streets followed a regular grid, and quarters were separated by functional purpose. There was a water supply system, and aqueducts brought water from distant sources. Sennacherib built an aqueduct 50 kilometers long for Nineveh, an engineering marvel of its time. The religion of the Assyrians was typical for ancient Mesopotamia. The main god was considered to be Ashur, the original deity of the city, which gradually turned into the supreme god of the whole empire. The king was considered the vice-regent of Ashur on earth. Wars were waged by order of the god. Conquered lands became the possessions of Ashur. This ideology gave religious justification for endless war. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was swift. A power that seemed unconquerable collapsed in a few years. This raises the question of why it happened. The answers help us understand not only the fate of Assyria but the general patterns of the rise and fall of empire. The Assyrian Empire was held together by constant conquests. The army needed to be paid, provinces controlled, and rebellions suppressed. All this required immense resources, which were obtained through new war. This was a system doomed to collapse. By the end of the 7th century, Assyria reached the natural limits of expansion. Without new conquests, the system began to fail. Everything depended on the personality of the king. A strong ruler could keep the empire in his hands. But as soon as a weak king appeared or a struggle for the throne began, the empire immediately weakened. Provincial governors gained too much power and became semi-independent lords. A system of checks and balances was absent. Everything was held together by fear of the king and his army. The Assyrians ruled with an iron fist, not attempting to win the hearts of their subjects. Deportations, mass executions, and the destruction of cities created an atmosphere of terror, but not loyalty. As soon as the empire weakened, all conquered peoples rose up simultaneously. Assyria had no allies, only enemies and intimidated vassals. When Babylon and Media began their offensive, no one came to help. Constant wars required enormous expenditures. Taxes were heavy, and obligations were burdensome. Agriculture suffered from conscription into the army. Trade was disrupted by war. By the end of the empire's existence, its economy was undermined to such an extent that it could not support a huge army and a bureaucratic apparatus. The appearance of new strong neighbors, Media in the east, a revived Babylon in the south changed the balance of power. These states were young and energetic. Their populations were not exhausted by centuries of war. They adopted the military technologies of Assyria but were free from its weaknesses. The alliance of Babylon and Media created a coalition that a weakened Assyria could not cope with. The lessons of Assyria are relevant for understanding any empire. A state based solely on violence, without moral attractiveness, is doomed to collapse. Fear can maintain power for some time, but not forever. Sooner or later, conquered peoples will rise up, and if an empire has no loyal allies, it faces a catastrophe. Economic sustainability is more important than military power in the long term. An empire that exhausts its resources on wars eventually weakens to such an extent that it cannot defend itself even from enemies it previously easily defeated. Internal stability, a developed economy, and a satisfied population, all these are more important than an army. Assyria possessed a magnificent army but neglected all other aspects of government, and that is what destroyed it. 3,000 years separate us from the heyday of the Assyrian Empire. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the study of Assyria remains important for understanding human history. The discovery of Assyria by the modern world began in the 19th century. By that time, the memory of the great empire had almost faded. Ancient authors mentioned Assyria in their writings, but their information was fragmentary. Medieval travelers saw huge mounds under which the ruins of ancient cities were hidden, but they did not understand what lay before them. The breakthrough occurred in the 1840s thanks to the French consul Paul Émile Botta and the English diplomat Austen Henry Layard. Botta began excavations of a mound near the Iraqi city of Mosul, where he assumed Nineveh lay. In 1843, he discovered the ruins of a huge palace with stone reliefs. It was the palace of Sargon II in Dur-Sharrukin. The find caused a sensation in Europe. The reliefs, depicting bearded warriors in armor, winged bulls, and scenes of battles, were completely unlike Egyptian or Greek art. This was an unknown civilization mentioned in the Bible but forgotten by history. Layard, in 1845, began excavations of the mound of Nimrud, where ancient Kalhu was located. His discoveries surpassed Botta's finds. He discovered the palace of Ashur-Nasirpal II with magnificent reliefs, giant statues of winged bulls, and thousands of clay tablets. Later, Layard returned to the mound of Kuyunjik and found Nineveh, under a multi-meter layer of earth. Palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, temples of gods, and a library with tens of thousands of tablets were hidden. One of the most important discoveries was the Library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of clay tablets covered with cuneiform signs were found in the rooms of the palace. They were scorched by the fire that destroyed Nineveh, which made them hard and well preserved. The tablets were sent to the British Museum, where work began on their decipherment. Among the tablets was the full text of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary work of humanity. The British Assyriologist George Smith, in 1872, discovered a tablet with a description of a global flood, strikingly similar to the biblical story of Noah. This discovery caused a huge resonance. It turned out that biblical subjects had Mesopotamian prototypes that existed millennia before the writing of the Old Testament. Excavations continued. German archaeologists in the early 20th century excavated Ashur. American expeditions worked in other Assyrian cities. Each find added new details to the picture of Assyrian civilization. The end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century became a time of trials for the Assyrian heritage. Wars in Iraq caused enormous damage to archaeological monuments. Looters robbed unprotected excavation. Traders in antiquities smuggled out artifacts. The National Museum of Iraq was looted in 2003. An even more terrible blow was the appearance of the Islamic State in 2014. These fanatics considered ancient monuments a manifestation of idolatry and methodically destroyed them. In 2015, militants blew up Assyrian sculptures in the Mosul Museum. Then followed the destruction of archaeological monuments in Nimrud and Khorsabad. The international community was shocked. UNESCO condemned these actions as war crimes against the cultural heritage of humanity. After the defeat of the Islamic State in 2017, it became possible to assess the scale of the damage and begin restoration work. Some destroyed monuments were partially restored, but much was lost irrevocably. The modern Assyrian diaspora, descendants of the ancient inhabitants of Mesopotamia, perceived the destruction of monuments as a personal tragedy. Although their connection to ancient Assyria is rather symbolic, they see these monuments as proof that their people have a great history. Assyrian organizations around the world have raised funds for the protection and restoration of cultural heritage. The study of Assyria continues. Archaeologists work in Iraq when security allows. Museums digitize their collections. Linguists continue to decipher cuneiform texts. Historians reevaluate established interpretations and offer new theories. Modern technologies open up new possibilities. Satellite imagery allows for the discovery of hidden ruins without excavations. Geophysical methods make it possible to explore monuments non-invasively. Three-dimensional scanning preserves accurate information about finds. Virtual reality offers new ways of presenting the past. The study of Assyria reminds us of the fragility of civilization, that even the greatest achievements can be lost. Assyria created an empire that seemed eternal but existed for only a few centuries. Its cities were destroyed, its population scattered, and its language forgotten. Only the writing carved on stone and clay has preserved the memory of it. At the same time, the story of Assyria shows the amazing resilience of the human spirit. Despite all the catastrophes, descendants of the ancient Assyrians still exist. They have preserved their identity, language, and culture through 2,500 years of adversity. This is proof that culture is not just monuments and artifacts, but above all people, their memory, and their tradition. When the sun sets over the hills of the Iraqi desert where the walls of Nineveh once stood, it is easy to imagine the past. Caravans walking along dusty roads, the clatter of guards' weapons at the city gates, the smell from market stalls, the prayers of priests in temples, the laughter of children on the streets. All this was a reality once, and now it is only an echo in the sand. But as long as we remember, as long as we study, as long as we tell stories, Assyria is not dead. It lives in our memory, in museum halls, in scientific works, and in the imagination of everyone interested in the human past. The history of Assyria teaches us that greatness and decline are two sides of the same coin, that force without wisdom is doomed, and that memory survives stone. And in this lies its light-filled lesson. Empires crumble, kings are forgotten, cities turn to dust, but the human spirit, the striving for knowledge, and the preservation of beauty and truth continue to live. The Library of Ashurbanipal survived the destruction of Nineveh. Words recorded on clay tablets 3,000 years ago still speak to us today. In this is the true victory over time, the true immortality of civilization. The Assyrian Empire traversed the path from a small trading city to the greatest power of the ancient world. Its history lasted about 2,000 years. During this time, dozens of kings changed, hundreds of wars occurred, and majestic cities were built and destroyed. Assyria left an indelible mark on the history of humanity, showing what a civilization obsessed with the idea of dominance can create. But it also showed the limits of power based on fear. An empire that ruled with iron and blood, that could not win the hearts of its subjects, that exhausted itself in endless wars, was doomed. Its fall was as swift and cruel as its rise. Nineveh turned into ruins in a few days. The people who had struck terror into the entire known world disappeared from the political map. But the memory of the grandeur and tragedy of Assyria was preserved in stone and clay, in writings and legends, reminding us that nothing earthly is eternal, but the striving for knowledge and beauty survives the centuries.